The gun was pressed against Clement Haskins's chest before Julia Bancroft even registered she had drawn it. Her hand was steady. Her heart was not. "Tell me the truth," she said, and her voice came out lower and colder than she had ever heard it, lower than the dust-choked wind pushing through the broken window slats of the Territorial Land Office, lower than the blood thundering in her ears. "Tell me right now, Clement, or I swear to everything holy and unholy in this territory that I will walk out that door and you will never see me again." He did not flinch from the barrel. That was the worst part. A man with a guilty conscience would have flinched. A man with nothing to hide would have raised his hands and laughed and told her to put the revolver down before someone lost a finger. Clement Haskins did neither. He stood with those broad, calloused hands hanging loose at his sides and those dark eyes fixed on her face with an expression she had been trying to decode for 3 months, an expression that sat somewhere between anguish and absolute certainty. "Julia," he said, just her name, like it cost him something. "The deed," she said. "The original deed to the Bancroft survey land. I found it this morning in your saddlebag. I found it, and I found the letter from your partner Aldous Prine, and I read every word of it, Clement. Every single word. So do not stand there and look at me like I am the one who has done something wrong." The silence that followed was the kind that swallows a room whole. Outside, Redemption Springs, New Mexico Territory went about its ordinary business in the autumn of 1882. Horses clipped and clopped along the main street. A woman laughed somewhere near the Mercantile. The territorial flag snapped and curled in the wind from the southern desert. None of it had anything to do with the two people standing inside the land office with a gun between them, and a secret that had been building like a thunderhead for 93 days. Clement exhaled slowly. He looked at the barrel of her revolver, then back at her eyes. He made his choice. "Everything I did," he said quietly, "I did before I knew you. I need you to hear that first." Julia's throat tightened. She did not lower the gun. "Then," she said, "you had better start from the beginning." She had arrived in Redemption Springs on a Tuesday, in the first week of July, on the back of a stagecoach that smelled of axle grease and old leather, and the particular desperation of people who had run out of options in every other direction. Julia Bancroft was 26 years old, and she had exactly $47.30 in the small embroidered purse she kept tucked inside the front of her travel dress. And she had a piece of paper that had come to her from a lawyer in Santa Fe, informing her that her late father, George Bancroft, surveyor and sometime prospector, had filed a land claim in the New Mexico Territory in 1877, and that the claim had never been properly contested, and that it was therefore hers to inherit if she could present herself in person at the Territorial Land Office in Redemption Springs before the first day of October in the year 1882. She had 2 months and 23 days when she arrived. She had come, in the simplest terms, to find her fortune. Her father had died penniless in a rooming house in Kansas City the previous winter, leaving her nothing but a box of old letters, a battered compass that had belonged to her grandfather, and this singular piece of information. The land, according to the lawyer's letter, encompassed nearly 400 acres of high desert terrain along the eastern edge of the San Andres Mountains. There was supposedly a reliable spring. There was supposedly a mineral vein running through the northeastern corner that an asser had once evaluated as promising. Whether promising meant anything in practical terms was a thing Julia had not yet allowed herself to calculate, because if it did not, then she had spent her last savings on a stagecoach ticket to the middle of nowhere for nothing at all. She stepped down onto the main street of Redemption Springs and let the heat hit her full in the face. It was the kind of heat that felt intentional, like the land itself was testing her. She squared her shoulders and picked up her trunk. The land office was a low adobe building with a warped wooden sign above the door, and she went there first because going there first was the only sensible thing to do, because sensibility was what she had instead of money, and because she was acutely aware that every hour she stood on the street was an hour she was not resolving the single most important question of her immediate future. The man behind the counter looked up when she came in, and that was the first time she saw Clement Haskins. He was not what she expected from a land office clerk, though she realized almost immediately that she should not have been surprised, because nothing in the New Mexico territory had yet been what she expected. He was tall in the way that men who work outdoors are tall, not the lanky, loose tallness of someone who has simply grown that direction, but the solid, broad-shouldered tallness of someone who has spent years moving through physical space and knows exactly how much of it he occupies. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the temples in the heat, and a jaw that looked like it had been set once and never changed its mind, and eyes the color of old creek water, a deep dark hazel that caught the light from the single window behind her and held it with an expression of mild professional interest. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he said. His voice was the same as his eyes, steady, measured, like he was not in any particular hurry about anything and never had been. "I hope so," Julia said. She set the lawyer's letter on the counter between them. "My name is Julia Bancroft. My father was George Bancroft, a surveyor. He filed a land claim in this territory in 1877, and I believe the claim still stands. I would like to confirm that and begin the process of taking title." He looked at the letter. He did not touch it. "George Bancroft," he said, and something she could not quite name moved across his face, very quickly, gone before she could study it. "Yes," she said. "Give me a moment," he said. He turned to the cabinet behind him, a tall wooden affair with dozens of shallow drawers, and he opened the third drawer from the top on the left side and pulled out a folder so thick with papers it bowed at the corners. He set it on the counter and opened it, and he went through the papers with a method and precision that told her he knew exactly where everything was and was simply performing thoroughness for her benefit or perhaps for his own. He found what he was looking for. He set it in front of her. It was a copy of her father's original survey filing. The land description matched what the lawyer had told her. The date of filing was March 14, 1877. George Bancroft's signature was at the bottom, his handwriting which she recognized instantly, the wide looping G, the careful cross of the T's. She felt something unwind in her chest. He had been real. The claim had been real. She had not come all this way for a ghost. "Is there a contest on the claim?" she asked. He took slightly too long to answer. "There was an attempt," he said carefully. "A man named Aldous Prine filed a competing claim in 1879, arguing your father had abandoned the survey. But your father's original filing had a proper continuation record attached to it. Prine's contest was denied." "And Prine accepted that?" she asked. "He accepted the ruling," Clement said. Which was not quite the same thing, and they both knew it. She looked at him steadily. He looked back at her with those creekwater eyes and that unreadable expression, and she decided then that she needed to understand this man better before she decided whether or not to trust him, because he was the keeper of the official record, because the official record was her only inheritance, and because there was something in the half-second pause before each of his answers that struck her as deliberate. "I will need to file a claim of inheritance," she said. "Can you tell me what I will need?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. And he walked her through every step with complete and unhurried accuracy, and she took notes on the small pad of paper she kept in her purse. And when she left the land office 40 minutes later, she had the precise list of every document and affidavit she would need. And she had also decided that the man named Clement Haskins was the most complicated, uncomplicated-seeming person she had ever met. She found lodging at the hotel on the east end of town, a two-story building whose second floor was slightly tilted but structurally adequate, run by a widow named Mrs. Almarook, who charged $1.50 a week and included breakfast and sometimes supper, and had very definite opinions about young women traveling alone in the territory, which she shared freely and without invitation. "You are not the first woman to come here alone chasing a land claim," Mrs. Rourke told her on the first evening, setting a plate of beans and cornbread on the table with the particular firmness of someone who has seen too much of the world to be soft about it. But you might be the most determined looking. That will serve you or it will bury you, depending on the week. I intend to let it serve me, Julia said. They all say that, Mrs. Rourke said, not unkindly. The next 3 weeks were the work of documents. Julia wrote to the Kansas City courthouse for her father's death record. She wrote to the lawyer in Santa Fe for his original notes on the claim. She went to the land office every few days, each time with another piece of her inheritance puzzle assembled, and each time she was met by Clement Haskins across that wooden counter, and each time the conversation was professional and precise, and lasted slightly longer than necessary. She began to notice things. He arrived at the office before sunrise. She could see the lamp burning in the window when she passed on her way to the well each morning. He ate his midday meal at the counter, working while he ate, which told her he was understaffed or overcommitted or both. He treated every person who came through that door with the same unhurried, careful attention, whether they were filing a mining claim or asking about cattle range boundaries or simply confused about a property line. He did not favor the wealthy over the ordinary. That was not common, in her experience, in any institution that dealt with land. She also noticed that he watched her. Not in the way that some men in the territory watched a woman alone, with that calculating appraisal that made her keep her hand near her revolver. He watched her the way a man watches something he is trying to understand, carefully, with something that might have been respect, if she was reading it correctly, and something that might also have been worry. She was not sure what to make of the worry. She found out why it was there on a Thursday afternoon in late July, when she came into the land office to deliver the last of her documents and found a stranger already at the counter. He was broad and florid-faced, with a yellow-gray mustache and small, pale eyes, and the manner of a man who has spent a long time being the most important person in any given room and has come to consider this a natural law. "I told you, Haskins," the man was saying as she came in, "this business needs to be settled before the October filing date. My offer is more than fair." Clement's face was neutral in the way a face is neutral when a great deal of effort is being applied to keeping it so. "The claim is not yours to settle, Mr. Prine," he said. The name hit her like a slap. Prine, Aldous Prine, the man who had tried to contest her father's claim. She set her folder of documents on the counter with a deliberate, audible thump, and both men turned. She looked at Aldous Prine with the full, clear weight of her attention. "Mr. Prine," she said, "my name is Julia Bancroft. George Bancroft was my father. I believe you are familiar with his land claim." A remarkable number of things happened in Prine's face in the next 2 seconds. Surprise, recalculation, the slight tightening around the eyes that she associated with men who have been caught mid-scheme and are now working very quickly to pivot. "Miss Bancroft," he said. He took off his hat. "I had no idea you were in the territory." "I arrived 3 weeks ago," she said pleasantly. "I am in the process of filing my inheritance claim." "Is there something I can help you with?" He put the hat back on. "Not at all," he said. "Merely old business, nothing that concerns you." "Everything about that land claim concerns me," she said. He smiled. It did not reach the pale eyes. "Of course," he said. "Of course it does. Well, welcome to Redemption Springs, Miss Bancroft. I am sure we will speak again." He left. The door banged shut behind him, and the little bell above it rang twice in the disturbed air. Julia stood for a moment, listening to his boots recede on the boardwalk outside. Then she turned to Clement. "How worried should I be?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she had not expected. "More than I'd like to tell you, and less than Prine wants you to be." It was the most honest thing he had said to her in 3 weeks. She leaned against the counter. "Tell me." He came around to the front of the counter, which he had never done before, and he pulled out 2 chairs from against the wall, and they sat across from each other in the close, paper-smelling air of the land office, while the afternoon light fell golden and indifferent through the warped window slats, and he told her what he knew about Aldous Prine. Prine had been in the territory since the late 1860s. He had started as a freighter, moved into cattle, then into land speculation, and somewhere along the way he had developed a particular talent for identifying land claims that had complications, contested titles, absent heirs, disputed boundaries, the kind of legal fog that made it difficult for an ordinary person to assert their rights, and then acquiring those properties for a fraction of their value by making the alternative seem worse than the settlement. He was not a violent man, not directly. He preferred legal mechanisms and financial pressure to physical force, but the outcome for the people who crossed him was usually the same. They left the territory with less than they had come with. "He wants the spring," Clement said. "Your father's land has the only reliable spring on the eastern approach to the mountains. Prine runs cattle on the adjacent land. Without that water access, his summer range is worthless." "Then he has a practical reason to want my land," Julia said. "A significant one. And he believes he can prevent me from securing title." Clement was quiet for a moment. "He has done it before," he said. "Not with violence, with paperwork, with delays and challenges and procedural objections filed at precisely timed intervals to exhaust the opposing party's resources." She looked at him. "Is he going to do that to me?" "I think," Clement said slowly, "that he intended to before you walked in today. And now he knows you are here and you are real and you are not going to be easily frightened off. That changes his calculation. I'm not sure yet in which direction." It was more information than she had any right to expect from a land office clerk. She was acutely aware of that. She was also acutely aware that he had just told it to her anyway. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Because it is your right to know," he said. "Because this office exists to protect the integrity of the land records, and that means protecting the legitimate claimants to those records." "That is the official answer," she said. A muscle moved in his jaw. "Yes," he said, "it is." She let it rest there. For now. She spent the first days of August doing two things simultaneously. She filed the remaining documents for her inheritance claim with the meticulous care of someone who understands that a single missing signature can unravel 6 months of work. And she began visiting her father's land. It required a horse, which she hired by the week from the livery stable, a solid roan mare named Pearl who had strong opinions about pace and direction, but ultimately yielded to a rider who knew what she was doing. And Julia had grown up riding. The ride to the survey land was approximately 2 hours south and east of Redemption Springs, through terrain that shifted from scrub flats to rocky high desert in a way that felt like watching the land reveal its true character by degrees. The first time she crested the last rise and saw it, she stopped Pearl entirely and just looked. The land was beautiful. She had not let herself expect that. It was the kind of beauty that had nothing soft or sentimental about it, all raw ochre and rust-colored rock, and the silver green of desert sage, with the San Andres Mountains pushing up against the blue sky to the west and the valley floor dropping away below her in a long, gentle sweep. And at the base of the next slope, exactly where her father's survey notes indicated, the spring. A thick cluster of cottonwood trees marked it, startlingly green against the surrounding desert, the only trees she had seen in 2 hours of riding. She could see the glint of water even from this distance. She sat on Pearl's back for a long time, looking at the land her father had walked and marked and recorded, the land he had believed in enough to file a claim on, and she felt something shift and settle in her that she had not known was unmoored. She would not let Aldous Prine take this. It was on her third visit to the land the following week that Clement appeared. She had not told him she was going. She was not sure how he knew, though she later understood he had seen her ride south from the livery window. He came over the rise behind her on a gray horse, moving at a steady trot, and when she turned in the saddle and saw him, she felt her pulse jump in a way she chose to attribute to surprise. "Mr. Haskins," she said, "are you following me?" "I was riding out to check the survey markers on the adjacent claim," he said. "The boundary lines happen to run through this area." "The boundary lines," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him. He sat very straight on the gray horse and looked back at her with those creekwater eyes and that infuriating composure. "There is a survey marker at the northeast corner," she said. "Shall we ride up and look at it together?" Something that was almost a smile appeared briefly at the corner of his mouth. "That would be appropriate," he said. They rode together to the northeast corner, where her father's iron survey stake was still sunk into the rocky ground, slightly rusty but solid, with the survey date and claim number stamped into the collar. Clement dismounted and crouched beside it and looked at it for a long moment, running his thumb along the numbers with an expression she could not read. "It is good work," he said. "Your father marked this land with care. He was a careful man," she said. She had dismounted too, and she stood a few feet from him, close enough to see the dust on his coat shoulders and the way the afternoon light caught the silver that was just beginning at his temples. She judged him to be in his mid-30s, not so much older than her that it changed anything. "Did you know him?" "No," Clement said. "He filed this survey before I came to Redemption Springs." "When did you come?" 1880, he said. "I took the land office post in March of that year." "Where from?" He stood up and looked at her. "Texas," he said, "near Abilene." "What brought you here?" The pause that followed was only a second long, but she had learned to notice his pauses. "The work needed doing," he said, "and I needed a change of scenery." She let it sit. She was beginning to understand that pushing Clement Haskins too directly on a question he was not ready to answer simply made him quieter. He was not a man who locked doors against pressure. He was a man who walked through walls on his own schedule when he determined it was time. They rode back toward Redemption Springs together as the sun began its descent, and turned the desert air that particular shade of burning amber that she was learning to associate with evenings in the New Mexico territory, a color that seemed to exist nowhere else, too warm to be gold, too fierce to be orange. He talked as they rode about the land, about the aquifer that fed the spring, about the elevation and what it meant for grazing and for a kitchen garden, about the geology of the mountain face to the west, and the way it created a natural windbreak that made the valley significantly more livable than the surrounding terrain. He talked about it in the way a person talks about something they have thought carefully about, with a precision that suggested the thinking had not been recent or casual. She realized he had been thinking about her father's land for a long time, before she arrived. "You know this piece of land very well," she said. He was quiet for a half-beat. "I have looked at a lot of the survey maps in this area," he said. "Comes with the work," she said. She filed that information carefully alongside everything else she was filing about Clement Haskins, in the part of her mind that she had designated for things that did not yet add up. August deepened, and the heat intensified, and the days fell into a rhythm that Julia had not expected to find comfortable and did. She worked on her claim documentation in the mornings, wrote letters to her contacts in Kansas City and Santa Fe in the afternoons, and spent her evenings on the hotel porch in the comparative cool, reading or talking with Mrs. Rourke or simply watching the town settle into the long violet twilight. Clement appeared in her evenings with increasing frequency, not in a way that was forward or improper. He would stop on the boardwalk on his way somewhere, pause to say something about the progress of her paperwork, or mention something he had found in the survey records that was relevant to her claim. And then somehow 20 minutes would have passed and they would still be talking, about things that had nothing to do with land claims, about the book she was reading and the geology of the territory and the politics of the new railroad spur being laid to the south, and what it would mean for the towns in its path. He read widely and had opinions he expressed with a careful precision that she found increasingly, unexpectedly delightful. One evening in mid-August, he brought her a copy of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that he had borrowed from the small lending shelf at the back of the general store, because she had mentioned in passing that she had always meant to read it. He held it out to her across the porch railing without ceremony or explanation, and she looked at the book and then at him, and something happened in her chest that she was not prepared for. "Thank you," she said. "It is worth your time," he said, and then he walked on. Mrs. Rourke, who had been sitting in the shadow of the doorway with her sewing, said nothing for a full minute after he had gone. Then she said, "That man has not voluntarily spoken to a woman in this town since the day he arrived." Julia looked down at the book in her hands. "He speaks to plenty of women at the land office." "That is different," Mrs. Rourke said serenely, and went back to her sewing. Aldous Prine made his next move on the 22nd of August. Julia was at the land office delivering a signed affidavit from her father's former survey partner, obtained at considerable effort and expense from his current address in Albuquerque, when Prine's lawyer, a thin man named Mr. Caswell from Santa Fe, walked in behind her and placed on the counter a formal objection to her inheritance claim on the grounds that the original 1877 filing contained a technical error in the legal description that rendered the claim void under territorial land regulations. She went cold all the way through her hands and stayed that way for approximately 2 seconds. Then she turned around and looked at Caswell with the expression she had learned from her father, who had spent 20 years as a surveyor dealing with men who tried to use technical language to obscure practical reality. "What error?" she said. Caswell smiled with the patient condescension of a man who charges $4 an hour. "The western boundary description references a landmark that does not appear on the official territorial survey map. Under Code Section 47, Paragraph 9, all boundary descriptions must reference approved landmarks. The landmark your father used does not appear in the official registry." Julia turned back to Clement. He was already pulling the survey map from the cabinet, spreading it on the counter, scanning it with an expression she had come to recognize as his working face, the one where everything else cleared away and there was only the problem. "The landmark your father used," he said quietly without looking up from the map, "was a mineral outcropping on the western ridge face. Natural feature. Does not appear in the official registry because the official registry was only compiled for the western portion of this territory, and this section of the San Andres was not included in the 1876 compilation." He looked up. His eyes went to Caswell. "However," he said, "Territorial Administrative Code Section 47, Paragraph 9 has an explicit exemption for claims filed in areas not covered by the 1876 compilation, which is subsection 12 of the same paragraph, which provides that natural features may be used as boundary references if they are described with sufficient specificity and recorded in the claim file. Your father's description is detailed and specific, Miss Bancroft. 4 sentences of detailed geological description. It meets the exemption standard." Caswell's patient smile did not waver, but his eyes had changed. "That interpretation of the exemption is debatable," he said. "It is the interpretation this office has applied consistently for 3 years, Clement said. "If you wish to challenge it, you are welcome to bring an appeal to the Territorial Land Commissioner in Santa Fe. That process takes approximately 4 to 6 months. Julia felt the breath she had been holding release slowly. She looked at Clement. He looked back at her with that steady, careful gaze, and there was something in it that she did not know what to do with, something that moved behind the professionalism like light behind a curtain. Caswell collected his objection papers and left. The moment the door closed, Julia turned to Clement and said, "Did you know he was going to do that?" A pause, not his usual kind, shorter, sharper. "I suspected it was a possible avenue," he said, "and you had the answer ready." "I try to know the regulations thoroughly," he said. "You knew the exact paragraph number," she said. "Without looking it up." He said nothing. "Clement," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. She had not planned it. It simply came out because the formal address had become suddenly inadequate. "Is there something you are not telling me?" He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Not yet." It was the most alarming, honest thing she had ever heard. She went home and lay on her bed in the tilted second floor of Mrs. Rourke's hotel and stared at the ceiling and thought about the way he had said not yet, as if there was a timeline attached to it, as if whatever he was keeping was being kept for a reason, and the reason had an expiration date. Not yet meant eventually. Not yet meant he intended to tell her. She turned that over in the dark for a long time. The days that followed had a new quality to them. Julia began spending time on the land itself, riding out 2 or 3 times a week, walking the boundary lines with her father's survey notes in hand, learning the terrain the way her father had learned it, with her feet on the ground and her eyes open. She repaired the survey stakes that had been loosened by winter weather. She cleared the brush from around the spring and found, beneath an overgrowth of mesquite, the foundation stones of a small structure her father had begun laying before his health had forced him to return to Kansas City. She sat beside those foundation stones one afternoon in late August and allowed herself, for the first time, to think about what this land could actually become. Not just an inheritance, not just a fortune, a place. A home. The word felt strange and full in her mouth, because she had not had a home in a real sense since her mother had died when she was 12, since she had been shuttled between various relatives with varying degrees of willingness, until she was old enough to make her own living, and had done so with the resourcefulness of someone for whom failure was not an available option. She was thinking about foundation stones and what one might build on top of them when she heard a horse coming up the south approach, and she turned, and it was Clement. He had begun riding out to the land when she was there. Neither of them had made an explicit arrangement about this. It had simply evolved, the way things evolve between two people who are both pretending not to need something they have started to depend on. He brought coffee sometimes, in a battered tin, the kind that survived long rides because it was so dented it had become structurally reinforced. She had started bringing biscuits from Mrs. Rourke's kitchen in the morning, enough for 2. He dismounted near the cottonwoods and tied his horse and brought the coffee over and sat beside her on the foundation stones, and they ate and drank in the easy silence that had become, she realized, her favorite part of any given day. "My father started this foundation," she told him. She ran her hand along one of the cornerstones. "He was going to build a house." "I can see that from the layout," Clement said. He looked at the stones with his measuring eyes. "He placed the north wall to take advantage of the mountain shade in the afternoon, smart thinking for the summer heat." "He was always thinking ahead," she said. "He planned carefully. He just never quite got to the point where the plans became real before something pulled him away." She paused. "He left my mother and me for the territories when I was 10. He came back sometimes. He wrote letters. I think he loved us in his way. He just loved the land more." Clement was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you came?" he asked. "To finish what he started." She thought about it honestly. "Partly," she said, "partly because I had nothing else, but I think also because I wanted to understand what it was about this place that was worth more to him than we were." He looked at her with those Creekwater eyes. "Have you found an answer?" She looked out at the valley, at the cottonwoods and the glinting spring and the vast indifferent beauty of the mountain face. "Getting closer," she said. He was close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm alongside hers without them touching. She was aware of every inch of that space. "What about you?" she said. "What are you thinking about when you look at this land?" He went quiet in the particular way that meant he was deciding how much to say. "I am thinking," he said at last, "that it is exactly the kind of place a person could build something permanent on." The word permanent sat between them in the afternoon air. They rode back to town that evening side by side, and he walked her to the hotel door, which he had begun doing without either of them remarking on it. And at the door he stopped and looked at her for a moment in the long blue dusk, and she thought he was going to say something. But he only tipped his hat and said good evening and walked back down the boardwalk toward the land office. And she stood in the doorway and watched him go and felt something that she had not felt in so long that she had to identify it slowly. Like translating a language she had learned as a child and half forgotten. She was in serious trouble. The trouble deepened through September in the most inconvenient and glorious way possible. The documents for her inheritance claim were nearly complete. Clement had guided her through every procedural requirement with an expertise that she had begun to suspect went beyond professional thoroughness, as if he had been anticipating each step before she needed to take it, as if he had thought through the entire process in advance. And then September arrived with a development she had not predicted. Aldous Prine offered to buy the land. He came to the hotel this time, not the land office. He came on a Monday morning, when Julia was at the small desk in her room working on the final notarized statement she needed. Mrs. Rourke knocked and told her there was a gentleman in the parlor, and Julia came downstairs to find Prine sitting in the parlor's best chair with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that she recognized immediately as the look of a man who has decided to shift from threat to charm. "Miss Bancroft," he said, rising, "thank you for receiving me." "Mr. Prine," she said. She sat in the chair across from him and kept her hands in her lap. "What can I do for you?" "I would like to make you a fair offer for your father's survey claim," he said. He named a figure. It was not what the land was worth. She knew enough now to know that, but it was more than she had expected him to offer, which told her he wanted the water access badly enough to negotiate. "What is the land worth to you?" she asked. He smiled. "I think it is worth considerably more to you if you intend to develop it yourself," he said, which was a smooth evasion, and they both knew it. "But development in this territory is expensive and difficult. I am offering you certainty. Cash. Today." "I did not come here for certainty," she said. "I came here for the land." He studied her with those pale eyes. "You are a practical woman, Miss Bancroft. Surely you understand that a single woman developing 400 acres of desert terrain is a significant undertaking. The construction costs alone would consume whatever capital you have at your disposal, and the territorial winters are hard on new construction. I am told the spring of 1880 was particularly devastating." "Thank you for the meteorological information," she said. "My answer is no." He put his hat back on. He rose. He looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite a threat and not quite a warning, and was uncomfortably close to both. "I hope you will reconsider," he said. "I am a patient man, Miss Bancroft. I have been waiting for that water access for 3 years. I am prepared to continue waiting, but I prefer not to." "Good day, Mr. Prine," she said. She went directly to the land office after he left. Clement looked up when she came in. He read her face in approximately 1 second and said, "Prine." "He offered to buy the land," she said. "I said no. He made a comment about patience and waiting that I did not enjoy." Clement set down the papers he was holding. He came around the counter. They had begun doing this, moving to the chairs by the wall when something needed to be discussed properly, an acknowledgement that some conversations required being out from behind the professional barrier of the counter. "He made a threat," Clement said. "An implied one," she said, veiled in cordiality. "What kind?" "The kind that says he has options he has not yet used," she said. "I don't know what they are." Clement was quiet for a moment. He looked at the floor. He was thinking about something. She could see it happening behind his eyes, that internal deliberation she had come to recognize, the weighing and considering and arriving. "Julia," he said. Again, just her name, the way he sometimes said it, like it required care. "Yes," she said. He looked up. "There is something I need to tell you." "Not yet," he said, and she heard the echo of those words from weeks ago. "But soon. Before the end of the month, I need to make sure of something first. But soon." She looked at him with the full weight of everything she had been feeling for the past 2 months, the trust and the caution and the want and the worry, all of it sitting in her chest in a complicated, compressed mass. "I have trusted you with a great deal," she said. "My claim, my time, more than that." "I know," he said. His voice was low. "Whatever you are keeping," she said, "I hope it does not change what I think about you." He looked at her with those eyes, and in them she saw something unguarded. The curtain pulled briefly aside, and what was behind it was something she recognized because she had been feeling exactly the same thing for weeks. "So do I," he said, quietly, fervently, like a prayer. She walked out into the September sunshine and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, eyes closed, face turned up, feeling the heat on her skin and her heart beating with a particular velocity that she had stopped pretending was anything other than what it was. She was in love with Clement Haskins. The realization was not a surprise. That was perhaps the most startling thing about it. It arrived not as a shock but as a confirmation, the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place, and she stood there in the sun and let herself feel the full, warm, terrifying weight of it for exactly 30 seconds. Then she opened her eyes and went back to her work, because she was Julia Bancroft and she had always functioned best when she had something to work toward, and right now there were two things she needed to secure before October: her inheritance and the truth about Clement Haskins. The truth, as it turned out, came for her before she went looking for it. It was the 14th of September. She was packing her saddlebag for the ride out to the land, because she had decided to spend the day measuring for the house foundation, and had brought a long coil of rope and her father's compass for the purpose, when she realized she had left her sketch pad at the land office the previous day, when she and Clement had been reviewing the survey map together. She went by the office early, before Clement arrived, because she knew from his schedule that he often spent his first 20 minutes of the morning at the county assessor's desk 2 buildings down. The land office door was unlocked. Clement left it unlocked from sunrise to sunset, on the principle that a land office should be accessible to the people it served. She went in and found her sketch pad on the counter where she had left it. She picked it up. She was halfway to the door when she saw the saddlebag under the counter. It was Clement's. She recognized it because it had a distinctive brass buckle with a small repair weld on the left side that she had noticed before. It was open and the top flap was folded back, and she could see the edge of a folder inside. She should have left. She would have left if the folder had not been sitting at precisely the angle that let her read the name written on the top document without touching anything. George Bancroft, 1877, original survey claim. She looked at that name for 2 heartbeats. Then she reached into the saddlebag and took out the folder. Inside was the original signed copy of her father's survey filing. Not a copy. The original, with the Territorial Land Office seal and the original signatures. Beside it was a letter, handwritten, dated 1879. The letter was from Aldous Prine to a man named Marcus Tolley, who had been the land office clerk before Clement arrived. It described, in clear and practical terms, a scheme to misfile the original Bancroft survey claim in a way that would obscure its existence until the claim expired through apparent abandonment, at which point Prine's competing claim would stand as the only valid record. In exchange for this service, Prine offered Tolley $300. There was a second letter. This one was from Tolley, addressed to Clement, dated March of 1880. It was a confession. Tolley wrote that he had accepted Prine's money and misfiled the original Bancroft documents, but that he had since become unable to live comfortably with that decision, and that he was leaving the territory for his brother's farm in Missouri, and that he was leaving the original documents for the incoming clerk with this explanation, because he believed the matter should be corrected, and he lacked the courage to do it himself. And there was a third letter. This one was in Clement's handwriting, addressed to Aldous Prine, dated April of 1880, which was 1 month after Clement had taken the land office post. In it, Clement informed Prine that he had discovered the fraudulent misfiling of the Bancroft claim, that he was in possession of the original documents and Tolley's confession, and that he was prepared to restore the Bancroft claim to the active record if an heir or the claimant himself came forward. He further informed Prine that he was retaining the original documents under his own custody rather than returning them to the active file, because he had reason to believe the active file was not secure, and that if Prine attempted any further interference with the Bancroft claim, the confession and the correspondence would be forwarded to the Territorial Land Commissioner. Clement had been holding Prine off for 2 years. He had known about the fraudulent scheme since his first month in Redemption Springs. He had held the original documents, her inheritance, in his own saddlebag to keep them safe. He had never told her. She held the folder in her hands and felt the cold clarity of betrayal move through her, sharp and clean as a knife, and then underneath it, fighting through it, the confusion. Because the letter to Prine was protection, not complicity. Because holding the documents safe meant he had not been working against her. Because everything he had done since she arrived had been exactly what a person would do if they intended to help her and not harm her. But he had not told her. 2.5 months. He had not told her. And then she heard his boots on the boardwalk and the door opened, and she was standing at the counter with the folder in her hands and the gun drawn before she had consciously decided to draw it, and she was pressing the barrel against his chest and telling him to start talking. "Everything I did," he said, "I did before I knew you. I need you to hear that first." She stood with the revolver pointed at his heart, and she looked at him, and she made herself stay very still and very focused, because the alternative was to do something with the emotion that was pressing against her sternum like a fist. "Tell me," she said. He told her all of it. He told her that when he came to Redemption Springs he had come with a purpose, that he had not taken the land office post purely for the work. He told her that in his previous position in Abilene, he had become aware of a pattern of fraudulent land claim manipulations being run by a network of speculators across 3 territories, and that Aldous Prine was one node of that network. He told her that he had come to Redemption Springs specifically because he had reason to believe there were fraudulent filings in that particular land office, and that he had accepted the land office post in order to find them and correct them. "I found Tolley's confession in the 3rd week," he said, "and I found your father's documents, and I made a decision. I had been writing to the Territorial Land Commissioner about the larger network of fraud, and I was trying to build enough evidence to have the entire scheme exposed and prosecuted, not just corrected on an individual basis. If I restored your father's claim to the active record and alerted Prine, Prine would understand that the confession existed and the evidence against him was active. I was afraid he would move to destroy the evidence. I was afraid he would run. I kept the documents safe and I held Prine in check, and I waited for the commissioner to complete the wider investigation." Julia was very still. "You were using my father's land claim as part of an evidence strategy," she said. "The claim was always safe," he said. "It was in my possession. No one could touch it. Except that I did not know it was safe because you did not tell me," she said. "I came to this territory believing my claim was in the public record and subject to all the normal risks, and you knew it was not and you said nothing." "I know," he said. "I was worried," she said. "I spent money on documents and affidavits and lawyer consultations because I believed I was building a claim from scratch and you had the original the whole time." "I know," he said again. His voice was heavy with it. "I know, and there is no version of that which is not a wrong done to you. I am not going to argue that it is. I am only going to tell you that at the moment I first met you, when you walked through that door and laid the lawyer's letter on my counter, I had already been living with this decision for 4 months, and I had already convinced myself that the greater good of exposing the entire network was worth the individual cost." He paused. "And then I met you, and I kept recalculating, and the calculation kept changing. Because of me," she said. "Because of you," he said. He looked at her, open and steady and without defense. "Because the more I knew you, the more I understood that the woman whose inheritance I had been treating as a piece of evidence was a real person with a real need, and that I had been wrong to weigh your need against the larger strategy as if one cancels the other. And because I was going to tell you, before October, I had already decided." "Not yet," she said, remembering. "Not yet," he said. "I needed the commissioner to complete the investigation first. He is in Santa Fe. I received word 2 days ago that the prosecutorial warrants for Prine and 4 other speculators are being sworn this week. Prine will be arrested before October. The evidence is complete." She looked at him. She looked at the folder in her hand. She looked at the gun she was holding against his chest. She lowered the revolver. She set it on the counter. She set the folder down beside it. She walked to the window and looked out at the main street of Redemption Springs in the autumn morning, the horses and the people and the ordinary, extraordinary business of a life in a frontier town, and she stood there for a moment and let everything she was feeling move through her without trying to manage it. Then she turned around. "You are infuriating," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are also the most principled person I have met in this territory, which makes it substantially more difficult to be properly angry with you." "I am sorry," he said, and he meant it in all the layers the word could carry. She looked at him for a long moment. He stood where he had been standing since he came through the door, which was to say he had not moved an inch, and she understood that he was standing that way deliberately, because he was giving her all the space she needed to make whatever decision she was going to make without any pressure from him in any direction. That was, she thought, very like him. "Tell me one more thing," she said. "The time you have spent with me. The evenings on the porch, the rides out to the land, the coffee." She paused. "The book." He looked at her and she could see exactly what was in his eyes now. There was no curtain, no careful professional management. "That was nothing to do with evidence," he said quietly. "That was only you." She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him, close enough that she could see the way his jaw had tightened, and the way his hands had finally, for the first time, closed into fists at his sides, the only thing that betrayed how very much he was holding still in the face of everything he was feeling. She put her hand on his chest, over his heart. She felt it beating through the cloth. Faster than she would have expected, fast as her own. "I am still angry with you," she said. "I reserve the right to be angry with you for a reasonable amount of time." "That is only fair," he said. "But I need you to understand something." She looked up at him. "I came to this territory to find my fortune, and I found it. It is exactly what I expected it to be in terms of the land. The spring, the mountain view, the foundation stones my father left, all of it." She paused. "And I found something. I did not plan for it all." His hand came up and covered hers, warm and careful, his fingers closing over hers with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the rest of him, with the strong angular face and the steady voice and the unbending principle. "Julia," he said, her name again. Always just her name, but different each time, and this time it held everything. "Do not keep things from me again," she said. "Ever." "Never again," he said. And it was a promise in the most complete sense. The kind that a man like Clement Haskins only makes when he is absolutely certain he can keep it. She rose on her toes and kissed him. There in the land office with the morning light coming through the warped window slats and her father's original survey claim sitting on the counter, and the whole wild, uncertain, beautiful territory spread out around them. And he kissed her back with a restrained, contained fervor that told her he had been waiting longer than she had, or at least had known sooner that he was waiting. When they broke apart, his hands were in her hair and her hands were against his chest, and neither of them was in any particular hurry to change that. "I think," she said, "that you owe me a great deal of coffee." He laughed. She had not heard him laugh before, not fully, and the sound of it was warm and surprised and genuine. "I will start immediately," he said. Aldous Prine was arrested on the 28th of September, 1882, by a federal marshal accompanied by 2 deputies from the Territorial Land Commissioner's office. The arrest took place at Prine's ranch house 6 miles south of Redemption Springs, and it was accomplished with the neatness and finality of a thing long prepared for. Prine's lawyer, Mr. Caswell, was simultaneously arrested in Santa Fe. 2 other speculators operating across the Mesilla Valley were taken the same week. The fraudulent scheme that Clement had spent 2 years building a case against unraveled completely and quickly. The way schemes built on hidden corruption always unravel when the foundation is finally pulled. The original Bancroft survey claim was formally restored to the territorial land record the following day. Julia's inheritance claim was approved on the 30th of September, 3 days before the filing deadline, and Clement placed the final stamped approval document on the counter in front of her with both hands flat on the wood, and looked at her across it with an expression that was equal parts professional satisfaction and personal relief. She picked up the document. She read every word of it. She set it down. "It is real," she said. "It has always been real," he said. "Now it is official." She looked at him across the counter. She thought about the day she had first come through this door, $47.30 in her purse and a piece of paper and a hope she had not quite let herself believe in. "Come to the land with me tomorrow," she said. "Yes," he said without hesitation. They rode out in the early morning of October 1st, in the particular crystalline light of an autumn morning in the New Mexico territory, a light that was nothing like the burning hammer of summer, but instead clean and exact and full of detail, so that every rock and sage branch and sweep of dry grass stood out with perfect clarity against the pale blue sky. They rode side by side without hurrying, and the horses moved with the easy companionship of animals who had made this journey often enough to stop being interested in the destination and become interested only in the present movement. At the rise above the valley, he stopped his gray horse and she stopped Pearl beside him, and they looked down at the land. The cottonwoods were beginning to turn, the first edges of gold showing in the leaves. The spring glinted. The foundation stones were pale and exact in the morning light. The mountain face was every shade between purple and rose in the low-angled sun. "It is mine," she said. For the first time she let herself say it fully without qualification. "It is yours," he agreed. She looked at him. He was looking at the land, at the spring and the foundation and the cottonwoods, and his face had the open quality it had when he forgot to be careful. "What do you want to do with your life, Clement Haskins?" she asked. The question had been building for 2 months. "After the land office, after all of this, what do you actually want?" He turned to look at her. The morning light was full on his face. "I want the kind of permanence I never let myself want before," he said. "A piece of ground that is mine, work that means something, people who stay." "People," she said. "A person," he said, very quietly, looking at her. She held his gaze. "I am going to build a house," she said, "on my father's foundation stones. I know how to read a survey map, and I know what the land needs, and I am not afraid of the work. But I have never built a house before." "I have," he said, "once in Texas before I came here." "You might have to teach me," she said. "I would be glad to," he said. She smiled at him in the October morning. He looked at her with those creekwater eyes, warm now in the light, warm in a way that had nothing to do with the sun. "I have not asked you properly," he said. "No," she agreed. "You have not." He dismounted from the gray horse and tied him to a sage branch and came around to her side, and she looked down at him from Pearl's back with her hands on the saddle horn and the whole wide blue sky behind him. "Julia Bancroft," he said, "I would very much like to build that house with you. And whatever else you decide to build after it, if you will have me." "That is still not quite a proper asking," she said. He looked at her with that almost smile at the corner of his mouth that she had loved before she knew she loved it. He reached up and she took his hand and stepped down from the saddle, and they stood in the dry grass with the horses patient behind them and the valley below them. "Will you marry me?" he said. "I am asking plainly, and I intend to keep asking until you say yes." "Once is sufficient," she said. "Yes." He kissed her in the October morning with the sun on their faces, and the cottonwood leaves going gold in the valley below, and the spring catching the light like a promise. And she thought that her father, who had loved this land enough to come all this way for it, would have found it fitting that the land he left her had brought her here, not just to the place, but to the person. They were married in Redemption Springs on the 15th of November, 1882, in a small ceremony at the Adobe Church at the west end of town. Mrs. Rourke cried with the deep satisfaction of someone who saw it coming from the first moment, and is now being proven correct about the entire matter. The federal marshal who had arrested Prine attended, because he had become unlikely friends with Clement in the weeks of the investigation's conclusion. The Territorial Land Commissioner sent a letter of congratulations and a case of good whiskey from Santa Fe, which was unexpected and appreciated. They spent their wedding night in the hotel, because the house was not yet built, and in the morning they rode out to the land together and began making plans on paper, the detailed architectural plans of two people who are not in any hurry because they have decided to do things right. Clement had accepted a transfer of his land office post to a district supervisor position that allowed him to work from Redemption Springs, overseeing the land records for the entire southern district of the territory. The work was important and he was good at it, and it meant they would not have to leave the place they had chosen. That was a thing that mattered more than either of them said directly, but that they both understood. The winter of 1882 was hard, as winters in the territory are, but they spent it making progress. The house foundation was reinforced and the walls went up, adobe brick by adobe brick, the work done on every day the weather permitted by Clement and two men from town who worked for wages and were reliable. Julia became conversant in adobe construction faster than anyone expected, which surprised no one who knew her. She also spent the winter designing the kitchen garden and mapping the spring's seasonal flow and drawing up a plan for the small orchard she intended to plant along the eastern slope in the spring. The house was habitable by February, not finished but livable, with a proper roof and a front door, and a kitchen with a cast-iron stove that Clement had arranged to have brought in on the freight wagon from Albuquerque, because he understood that a good stove was not a luxury but a foundational necessity, and this was the kind of man he was. They moved in on a cold, clear Thursday in February 1883, with their belongings stacked in the back of a borrowed buckboard, and the horses tied behind, and the winter sun very bright on the Ochre Hills. They stood in the main room of the unfinished house, with bare adobe walls and wooden floors that were still waiting for their final sanding, and they looked at it. "It is not much yet," she said. "It is exactly what it needs to be," he said, "and then a little more every day after that." She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they stood in the new house on her father's old foundation, in the middle of the land that was hers and now theirs, and listened to the territorial wind move around the solid walls and find them unshakable. Spring came early that year. The winter rains, which had been more plentiful than usual, had done something remarkable to the desert. The valley came alive in March with a display of wildflowers that Julia had not known was possible in this landscape. Broad sweeps of color across the rocky slopes, red and gold, and the surprising delicate purple of desert verbena. And the cottonwoods along the spring put out their first green in the second week of March, and the air smelled of water and new growth, and the particular bright mineral scent of the territory after rain. The orchard saplings went in the ground on a warm day in late March. Clement had sourced them from a nursery in Albuquerque, a careful selection of varieties suited to the altitude and the dry summer, apple and pear, and one peach tree that the nurseryman had said was a gamble but worth trying. Julia planted each one herself, on her knees in the turned earth, her hands deep in the soil her father had surveyed, and she thought about the fact that these trees would not bear fruit for several years, and that planting them was an act of faith in the future, an assertion that there would be a future worth the waiting. It was in April, just as the fruit trees were putting out their first tentative leaves, that she understood she was expecting a child. She told Clement on a Sunday evening when they were sitting on the porch they had added to the south face of the house, a simple covered structure with 2 chairs and a table, where they had fallen into the habit of sitting in the evenings just as they had once sat on Mrs. Rourke's hotel porch in town, watching the light go out of the sky. "I believe," she said, "that there will be 3 of us before winter." He turned to look at her. In the fading light, his face went through several things in rapid succession, surprise and certainty and a joy so straightforward and unguarded that she felt it move through her like warmth. He took her hand. He did not say anything for a moment, just held her hand and looked at her with those eyes, and then he said very quietly, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. Better than well. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles and closed his eyes for a moment, and she watched him do it and felt the love she had for him as a physical presence in the evening air, something solid and real as the adobe walls behind them. The summer of 1883 was full of work and heat, and the deep, uncomplicated satisfaction of people who have found their place and are building it up. The house grew more finished week by week. Clement installed glass windows in June, proper glass shipped from Albuquerque, and the light that came through them in the mornings was so different from the dusty, filtered light of the previous winter that it felt like a new house entirely. Julia spent her mornings in the kitchen garden and her afternoons indoors as the heat intensified, writing letters and reading, and doing the financial accounting for the land operation, which she handled with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. They had hired a hand, a young man named Tobias Garrett, who was 21 and from Oklahoma, and had a gift with horses that bordered on the uncanny and a cheerful resilience that made him pleasant company in the long working days. Tobias lived in the small bunkhouse they had built alongside the main barn and treated Clement with respectful friendship and Julia with a careful, genuine courtesy that she appreciated. The spring proved as valuable as her father had believed it would be. The water rights were now legally secured, and she had negotiated a water-sharing arrangement with two neighboring ranchers that brought in additional income while maintaining her primary access. It was a practical and fair arrangement, and both sides were satisfied with it, which was the only kind of arrangement Julia Bancroft was willing to make. Word had spread through the territory about the Prine fraud case and about the land office clerk who had quietly and persistently dismantled it over 2 years. Clement bore the resulting reputation with characteristic discomfort. He did not enjoy being spoken about. He was more comfortable being the person who solved things than being spoken of as the person who had solved them. Julia found this endearing and also slightly exasperating, and told him so, which made him laugh in that warm, surprised way she had decided was her favorite sound. Their son was born on the 4th of December, 1883, in the house on the foundation stones, with Mrs. Rourke in attendance because she had ridden out from Redemption Springs 2 days earlier with the certainty of someone who knows when she is needed and does not wait to be asked. The birth was hard, as first births often are, but Julia Bancroft was not a woman who was broken by hard things, and by morning she was propped against the pillows with the baby in her arms and a clarity of feeling that she had no precedent for. Clement sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at the child in her arms with an expression that made her eyes sting, not with sadness but with the particular overwhelm of witnessing a person encounter something they did not know they had been waiting for. "He looks like you," she said. The baby had dark hair and a frown that she recognized. "He looks like himself," Clement said, which was exactly the right thing to say. They named him George Clement Haskins, for her father and for himself, and he was a solid and opinionated baby who grew into a solid and opinionated child with his father's methodical mind, and his mother's refusal to be discouraged by obstacles. The years that followed were the kind of years that do not make dramatic stories but make remarkable lives. Clement continued his district supervisor work and became, in time, one of the most respected land administration officials in the territory, known for his absolute integrity and his encyclopedic knowledge of the land codes, and his willingness to ride 2 days in either direction to sort out a boundary dispute fairly. Julia developed the Bancroft land into a small but thriving operation, with the spring water supporting the orchard and the kitchen garden, and a modest cattle operation that grew steadily, if not spectacularly. She also began, in 1885, writing a series of articles for the territorial newspaper in Albuquerque about land rights and the legal tools available to homesteaders and small claimants, which were read widely, and which she had the deep satisfaction of knowing were genuinely useful to people in situations like the one she had been in when she first stepped off that stagecoach. The peach tree bore fruit for the first time in 1886. That felt like a milestone, perhaps an unreasonably emotional one. But Julia stood under it in the September morning and looked at the pale gold fruit hanging in the branches and thought about faith and patience, and the things worth waiting for, and felt the full curve of the past 4 years bend back and settle into a shape that made sense. Tobias Garrett stayed on. He became, over time, less a hired hand and more a person integral to the life of the Haskins land, and they compensated him accordingly and treated him accordingly, and there was never any question about his place there. He was a quiet and steady presence, and they were both genuinely glad of him. In the spring of 1886, Julia found herself expecting again. She told Clement on the same porch where she had told him about George, at the same time of evening, in the same quality of fading light, and he looked at her with the same uncomplicated joy and took her hand and pressed it to his mouth, and they sat together in the evening air and listened to the spring running in the valley below. Their daughter was born in November of 1886, healthy and loud, and immediately definitive about her preferences in the way that second children often are when they have studied the first and decided to be entirely different. They named her Ruth Eleanor Haskins, and she was from the beginning everything her brother was not: impulsive where he was deliberate, vivid where he was steady, and possessed of a singing voice that she deployed without warning and at significant volume, a trait that was not particularly traceable to either parent. George adored her immediately and completely, with the serious devotion of a 3-year-old who has just received an unexpected gift and intends to protect it indefinitely. The house grew to accommodate them: a second bedroom, then a third, a proper porch on the east side to catch the morning light, a library, which was perhaps Julia's greatest personal satisfaction, 2 walls of bookshelves in the room they had designated for it, filled with volumes that arrived by post from Albuquerque and Santa Fe, augmented by Clement's own collection, which he had kept in boxes since Abilene, and had never quite believed he would have a permanent place for. Mrs. Rourke came to dinner on the first Sunday of every month. She was, as she had always been, entirely satisfied by the confirmation of her own early predictions about Clement and Julia, and she said so regularly, and with great warmth. The territory became a state in 1912, though that was many years still ahead of the point this story has reached. In the autumn of 1887, with the children growing and the orchard productive and the spring reliable as it had always been, life on the Bancroft Haskins land had achieved something that Julia sometimes paused to examine carefully, because she had not entirely trusted it would hold when she first found it. It held. It held in the particular way that things built carefully on good ground hold, not without difficulty or worry or the ordinary hard seasons that land and life together always produce. The drought of 1887 was genuinely frightening for 2 months, and they made careful decisions about the cattle and the water and got through it. George went through a period at age 5 of being afraid of the dark that required considerable patience and creativity to address. Clement, in 1888, spent 3 weeks away from home dealing with a particularly complex fraudulent filing in the Northern District, and Julia missed him with an acuteness that clarified for her exactly what the quality of ordinary evenings together was worth. But through all of it and beyond all of it, the thing held. On a Sunday evening in September of 1888, 6 years after Julia Bancroft had stepped off a stagecoach in Redemption Springs with $47, and a hope she had not quite let herself believe in, she sat on the east porch of the house she had built on her father's foundation stones, with the mountain face turning purple in the last light, and the cottonwoods along the spring bright gold in their autumn turning, and the orchard visible from where she sat. The peach and apple and pear trees standing patient and established and real. George was at the table inside with his father, working through an arithmetic problem with the focused seriousness he applied to all problems, asking questions with the same careful precision she had always loved in Clement. Ruth was in the yard below the porch, singing to herself in the long grass with the entire concentrated joy of a 2-year-old who has found a grasshopper and considered this sufficient entertainment for the evening. Clement came out and stood behind her chair and put his hands on her shoulders, and she reached up and covered his hands with hers. "Ruth found a grasshopper," she said. "She has been informing it of her feelings about it for approximately 10 minutes, he said. She laughed. He came around and sat in the chair beside her, and they were quiet in the way they had learned to be quiet together, which was not absence but presence, the comfortable close attention of two people who have shared enough time and difficulty and joy to understand that silence between them is not empty. The last light went off the mountain. The stars came out over the desert in that extraordinary way they do in the high territory, not a gradual appearance but a sudden population, as if they had been waiting for the precise moment. Ruth came up the porch steps with the grasshopper carefully contained in her small hands, offering it for inspection. Clement received the grasshopper with the gravity it deserved. Julia watched him do it, and felt the love she had for him as a thing entirely woven into the fabric of the ordinary, inseparable from the porch and the stars and the sound of the spring and the small warm weight of her daughter's hands. She had come to the territory to find her fortune. She had found it, all of it, the spring and the foundation stones and the land her father had marked and loved and left to her. And she had found the thing she had not known to look for, which was worth more than all of it, more than the 400 acres and the water rights and the orchard and the mineral vein in the northeast corner that had turned out to be silver-bearing and modestly valuable, and a very welcome practical surprise. She had found Clement Haskins, who had kept her inheritance safe before he knew her, and who had told her the truth when the truth was hard, and who had built a house with her and planted trees with her, and sat on the porch with her in the evening dark, and never once stopped looking at her with those creekwater eyes as if she was the answer to the question he had been asking since before he knew what the question was. She reached over and took his hand where it rested on the arm of the chair. He turned his palm up and held her hand and looked at her in the starlight with that expression she had spent 6 years learning to read and still found inexhaustible, deep as the aquifer beneath the spring, steady as the mountain. "Content," he said. "Thoroughly," she said. "You. More than I knew was possible," he said, and meant it in every particular. Ruth, having decided the grasshopper had been adequately introduced to all relevant parties, released it into the dark with the benevolent authority of a child who understands that all things deserve their freedom. It vanished into the grass. She watched it go with complete satisfaction. Then she climbed into her father's lap and put her head against his chest and was instantly, entirely asleep, the way very young children can be, without transition or ceremony. George appeared in the doorway, arithmetic completed, to announce this fact and ask if there would be pie. There was pie. They sat together on the east porch of the house on the Bancroft land in the New Mexico Territory in the autumn of 1888, under the extraordinary stars, and the night was warm and quiet around them, and the spring ran on in the dark below the cottonwoods, and the orchard stood patient and established on the eastern slope, and the land was theirs, and the life was theirs, and it was more than enough, more than fortune. More than anything Julia Bancroft had planned for when she stepped down from that stagecoach into the hammering July heat with a leather purse and a piece of paper and all the courage she owned. It was everything, and it held.